Coming up on Main Street, we're going to take a trip down the Bourbon Trail, where history, tradition, and science meet to create something very special. Join us for Main Street, Kentucky Spirits.
Funding for Main Street was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you who support quality programs such as Main Street that appear only on public television.
Hello and welcome to Main Street. I'm Barbara Deeb. On this edition of the program, we're going to take a journey down the Bourbon Trail. We're going to see the places where bourbon is distilled and meet the people who create Kentucky's signature beverage. We're here at the Corsair Artisan Distillery in Bowling Green. We thought it was a great place to start our journey. Our first destination is the Wild Turkey Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. This brand of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey has been distilled in and around the area since 1869. Master Distiller Jimmy Russell takes us on a tour of the facility, gives us an insight into how bourbon is made, and why after 60 years on the job, he can't wait to work a few more. The next stop on our journey is the Wilderness Trace Distillery in Danville, Kentucky. Founded in October of 2013, this brand new facility houses both tradition and science when creating their version of Kentucky bourbon. Co-owner Pat Heiss lets us in on this technique for creating the perfect spirit, but we'll have to wait a little while, 4 to 7 years, to taste the results. Our journey ends at the Woodford Reserve Distillery in beautiful Versailles, Kentucky. Master Distiller Chris Morris takes us through the process of creating a style of premium small batch Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey that speaks to the history and art of a spirit that is such an integral part of Kentucky. We're on a trip down the Kentucky Bourbon Trail on this edition of Main Street, Kentucky Spirits.
Well, when I first started here, we was making about 70 barrels a day. Small place, had 4 storage buildings that held 20,000 barrels each. Now we have 26 storage buildings that holds 20,000 barrels. We went from making 60 to 70 barrels a day to 570 barrels a day. We have a little over 500,000 barrels in storage right now. And we're strictly a one brand operation. Everything comes out of here is Wild Turkey bourbon. You know, bourbon is the only true American spirit. Bred, born, and raised from Bourbon County, Kentucky, which is over at Paris, Kentucky now. That's where it got its start and everything. And everything is under federal government supervision. We can only use the barrel one time. We can never use no color, no flavor, or nothing can be added to bourbon. If you add flavor or color, just like our American honey or our spice, we come out with a spice bourbon last year. When we add something to it, then it can't be called bourbon anymore. It's whiskey. That's what we strive for here, to keep that tradition, the history of true bourbon. Well, Wild Turkey was started by the McCarthy family, Austin Nichols Company, which was started in business in 1855, back in that day and time. Most all your corporate offices was in New York City at that time. And all the businessmen in New York City went on a turkey hunt every year down in the Carolinas. And they happened to pull it straight out of the barrel. His time to bring the bourbon, they'd bring the food, the bourbon, wine, is all in the business. And he just happened to pull it out of the barrels. It happened to be 101 proof. They liked it so well. At sitting around at night, they kept saying, well, this tastes different. The big difference is 101 proof instead of 100 proof. And he said, well, they like it so well, so make a long story short, the next year they said, you bring some more of that same bourbon. Well, he didn't know, but we come under federal government supervision, so we have to keep records of everything. And he called them and asked them what, and they pulled some of the same bourbon. And they're sitting around that night after hunting all day, they liked it so well. He said, well, if they like it, I'm going back, I'm going to start bottling 101 proof and call it Wild Turkey after the Wild Turkey hunt. Well, our federal government tells you how the most heavily restricted product in the world. It has to be made from at least 51% corn, has to be distilled under 160 proof, and must be put in a new charred oak barrel at 125 proof or less. So every bourbon distillery has their own formula, and I like to use simple terms. It's like us cooking at home. You and I can cook the same dish at home and call it the same thing, but they won't taste the same. The percentage of corn, rye, and barley malt, the cooking temperatures, the distillation temperatures, and all that plays a very important factor. The type of grain, corn, rye, and barley malt, or some use corn, wheat, and barley malt. But all of that, the percentage of each one of them, we use less corn and more rye and barley malt. We haven't changed the formula here. The same formula the day I come here in 1954. We make our own yeast. We have our own yeast culture. We make our own yeast every day. And all I can tell you about the yeast, I know it's 59 years old. It was here when I got here, and we're still using the same yeast. You got to have good water, which all this area is limestone water. You got to have good water, good grains, and then you formula how you want your product to taste. With Wild Turkey, I say, we're still making it the old-fashioned way. We distill it low proof, put it in a barrel at low proof. The higher you distill anything, the less flavor you're going to have. It's like cooking at home. You cook something, you keep cooking, you cook all the flavor out. Same way in making bourbon. The higher you distill it and everything, the less flavor you're going to have in it. Well, that's the hardest part about it is, trying to figure what people's going to like 8 to 10 years from now. What's your taste buds going to be? This is one of the hardest things. But we have quarterly meetings, how our sales and marketing is going. We can adjust up or down during the process of making. If you make too much, we have to pay taxes on each barrel that sits here and ages each year to the state. So if you make too much and you've got your money tied up, if you don't make enough, well, you haven't lost any money, but you have lost money in one way, because if you had more, you could sell it. So it's a proposition that you have to be in touch with all the time, trying to figure out how much to make each year. We tease and cut up in Kentucky. We've got about a little over 4 million people in the state of Kentucky. We got over 4.5 million bourbon barrels stored in Kentucky, so we got more bourbon barrels in Kentucky than we have people. Well, the bourbon business has been great for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I say it's born, bred, and raised here, but most of Kentucky is still in Prohibition. A lot of 3/4 of Kentucky is still dry. We're that way. They say we make 95% of the bourbon for the world, but we probably make more than that. The best thing, enjoying the company, the people, your friends, family. I consider we're all family here, and then being in the bourbon business with all other bourbon distilleries, we're all close friends. We're together all the time and enjoy being with each other. We're in competition in one way, but another way, we're friends. We'll do anything we can to help any other bourbon distillery out when they're in trouble. If anything's going wrong, if they need help, we'll help them. If we need help, they'll help us. That's the thing I enjoy so much about it. Yes, this is my September the 10th, I'll be here 60 years. And fortunate to have my son been here with me. Eddie's been here 33 years with me. I got to work with my dad a little while here. My wife actually worked here before I did, and she stayed home, took care of the children, and then she went back to high school and the administration end of it and retired from that. So she's enjoyed it. My family's all enjoyed the bourbon business. It's been great to us. It's something I love. It's not a job to me. It's something I enjoy doing. I only live 6 miles away. I live within a mile of where I was born and raised. And I'm one of those that when it becomes a job, I'll retire. It's something I enjoy. I've heard people say, I hate to get up and go to work. I can count on one hand the days. If I miss a day, they think something's wrong around here. But I enjoy it. You get such wonderful people working here generation after generation, and you get to see them every day, and we're all close friends. It's no me and them, or we're all the same. It makes no difference here. We're all the same. It's all of our office doors are always open to everybody. It's no closed doors or anything. It's a family affair.
The distillery is something that came about over the last decade. My business partner and I, we first started a business called Firm Solutions, and we provide products and services to fuel alcohol and beverage alcohol producers around the world. And so over the last 10 years, we've been working with these various distilleries and coming up with new ways to improve their processes as well as marketing products. And so this is just a natural diversity for us to expand into our own distilling operation. Wilderness Trace Distillery has only been producing now for about 4 months. But we started up officially in late 2012, early 2013. In my opinion, a craft distillery is a small distillery, so we have very tight control over our operations. We actually know personally the farmers that grow the grains that are used in our process, and those grains are grown here locally. So I think that craft distilling offers an advantage in that you have the ability to pick and choose who you're buying your grains from, where you're getting your other ingredients from, and if they are locally sourced, you sort of have the ability to produce a product that has a fingerprint that is relative to the geographical region that you're in. In terms of a tourist destination, it gives us an advantage because someone can come in here and instead of going through 5 different buildings and kind of piecemealing the process, literally we can stand in one location and, you know, here are the cookers, here are the fermenters, here is the distillation equipment, you know, here is the equipment we use to gauge the product down, here are the barrels. And so really I think it's easier in terms of tourists and somebody looking for a good bourbon experience and to learn about the process, to come in a smaller facility like this and actually to be able to see everything all in a very small area. We have approached this from a very scientific method. We didn't start with a recipe book that was 150 years old. You know, we have a little bit of flexibility and creativity to where we can generate our own products and without having to stick to, you know, an old-time recipe. I mean, we can use the materials that are available to us. You know, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so we dove into the scientific literature that's available, which is 100 years plus of good literature, as well as our experiences in almost 200 distilleries around the world. So we take the best practices from each of those and formulate a plan based on what we think are the best practices. The process is so complicated from beginning to end. I mean, it's not just like giving somebody a recipe and then they can go home and make a loaf of bread that tastes just like yours. There's so many different steps that go into the process that it's just almost impossible to steal someone's recipe or their process because you just cannot duplicate the product you're using. Even if you use the same amount of the different types of grain, if that grain was grown in a different area or it's a different variety, or I mean, there's just so many different factors, you know, beyond just what is the grain recipe. And so I think that contributes to why distilleries work so well together. Not to mention that we're all kind of in a pretty small geographical area. We are planning to age our bourbon for around 5 years. But again, that's just depends on the taste and the flavor profile and how that development occurs. You know, there's only so many times you can walk past an aging barrel before you take a little bit and try it. And so that point for us came at about 4 months, which was last weekend. We were in here and we just couldn't wait any longer. And so we tried some of the product and it was phenomenal. I could not believe that it was so good just after 4 months. Knowing the product is excellent, it helps me to, you know, I'm not bragging when I tell people you're really going to love this product, and I just simply know they are going to love it. And so that's kind of the setup for, now here's your sample, and then the rest is, you know, usually goes exactly like I thought it would.
Bourbon is such a special product because it is part of Kentucky's culture. It is part of Kentucky's history. The two are so intertwined that most people don't realize how important bourbon has been to the Commonwealth. And when you travel around the world and you say Kentucky, people are going to think of a couple of things. And believe it or not, it's not basketball. It's bourbon and horses. And we know, of course, the great contribution that Colonel Sanders gave to the world. So we are Kentucky around the world. The history of Woodford Reserve and the history of the Woodford Reserve Distillery are an interesting combination. The distillery is quite old, it's quite historic, and the Woodford Reserve brand is a very new interpretation or reinterpretation of bourbon that dates back all the way to 1996. So the story begins in 1812 when the Pepper family moves here from Bourbon County, of course, and starts distilling on Glens Creek at what is now known as the Pepper Spring. The spring is what brought them here. Well, the second generation of the Pepper family built our current distillery in 1838, and that was Oscar Pepper. And he named the distillery after himself, the old Oscar Pepper Distillery. His distiller was James Christopher Crowe, the famous Old Crow, the namesake of the brand. And it was the combination of Crowe and Pepper who created modern bourbon as we know it today, using new charred oak barrels, using the sire mash process. Every history book gives them credit for creating the product we know today as bourbon whiskey. Well, the third generation of the Pepper family, James E. Pepper, sold the distillery in 1878 to what we would call a distributor now, but it's a company called LeBroy & Graham. And LeBroy & Graham runs the distillery up until Prohibition, close, reopen after Prohibition, and in 1941 sells to our parent company, Brown-Forman. 1959, the world is changing. Bourbon sales are going into a slump, which ends up being a long decline, and Brown-Forman closes the distillery, removes equipment, barrels of bourbon, and allows the property to sit. And in 1971, we sold the property to a neighboring farmer because the distillery sat in the midst of a 500-acre farm. And in the late 1980s, imported spirits at very high prices were becoming popular with the American consumer. And Brown-Forman decided to enter that business, but enter it in the best way we knew possible, in the bourbon business. And we decided to create a new super premium bourbon whiskey, and that began the Woodford Reserve Project. So we bought the site back from the same farmer's family, and we began the restoration of the buildings and the beginning of the 5 sources of flavor concept. How would we make this new bourbon that had no name, that had no image, that had no personality? We were starting from scratch. We're real proud that when a visitor comes to the Woodford Reserve Distillery, they're literally going to see and experience the entire bourbon making process and how each of the 5 sources of flavor, 5 processes we follow, have an impact on the final product. What the grain recipe brings to Woodford Reserve, the spiciness of the rye, how our wonderful limestone water with its micronutrients and minerality is going to bring floral notes to Woodford Reserve. Our extra long fermentation process with our unique strain of yeast will add floral notes, and then we will capture the spicy, floral, and fruit notes by triple distilling in our unique copper pot stills, and then the spirit will be entered into the 5th and really the most important source of flavor, maturation, in our own custom crafted new charred oak barrels for that long period of time in our warehouse. So it's hard to imagine when we were renovating this historic site, this room, this building was empty. It was just 4 walls. So everything here we put in, Brown-Forman put in specifically to craft Woodford Reserve. And I think one of the great ironies of our story is to make this contemporary bourbon that had never existed before until 1996. We decided to turn the clock back and use old-fashioned equipment. We could have put in stainless fermenters, stainless steel. That would have been smart. But instead we put in red cypress, old-style fermenters. Why? Because that's what Crowe and Pepper had. They didn't have steel. So these look very old. They're actually quite new. They have just aged. And we will cook our mash, the corn, rye, and malted barley with our limestone water, fill a fermenter, add our unique strain of yeast, And 6 days later, we have the beginnings of Woodford Reserve. It's called Distiller's Beer. It's about 10% alcohol. It's up to the stills to separate the alcohol and the flavors we want from the grain, the water, and the spent yeast. So it's now from mash to distiller's beer, and then from distiller's beer to spirit in the still house. And the use of copper pot stills is very appropriate because we know in 1825 that Pepper Distillery had 6 pot stills, and we actually had these stills crafted for us in Scotland. So the largest of the stills is the beer still, and that takes the fermented mash, the grain, the water, the yeast, and the spirit all together, and the spirit's driven off and collected. That spirit is called low wine. When we've collected enough low wine, we will charge, in other words, fill the middle still, which is appropriately called the high wine still because we'll redistill the low wine into high wine, removing some water, removing some alcohols that have characteristics we don't want, and end up with approximately 110 proof spirit. It's higher than the original proof. That spirit will be transferred to the third still, the spirit still, where the final product will be crafted. And from there, it will go into a holding tank. All we will do is add pure water to it, and then into barrel it will go. Now the spirit safe is the actual control panel. There are no computers running the Woodford Reserve Distillery. Everything is done in this spirit safe, just as it was in the 1800s. So the spirit will end up over here in our filling station, where we will fill each barrel by hand, one at a time. And bourbon cannot be entered into a barrel at over 125 proof, and we enter at a relatively low 110 proof. And we do that for flavor. If we entered the barrel at 125 proof, we would use 14% less barrels. So in other words, we are putting more wood into Woodford Reserve by adding that little bit of water prior to barreling. So we have a lot more wood exposure, and since the wood, the maturation cycle is the reason for all of our color and 50 to 60% of our flavor and aroma, we just think it's important to have more barrel exposure. When you fill the barrel, we're going to fill it completely full, no head space, no air gap. Within a day, we will have lost 3 to 4 gallons of spirit. The wood will absorb the spirit, and we'll have head space now. The head space will just continue to grow over the years as the process we know as the angel share process advances. Because the barrel's wood, it breathes. It's not stainless steel or plastic or glass, it's wood. Alcohol and water vapor leave, air enters the barrel, which creates a series of natural reactions that create more flavor. So the angel share process is vital to the maturation of our great whiskey. It comes at a cost. The longer you go, the less you have. And typically, at the end of 7 years, a Woodford Reserve barrel will have lost approximately 45 to 50% of its original content. But we again believe it's worth it because the resulting spirit is rich and concentrated and balanced and nuanced as you can imagine. The question of how much do we make is a great team effort. We go out into the field from country to country, from state to state, wherever Woodford Reserve is sold, and we ask our local salespeople, how much do you need over the next 10 years? And we constantly update that prediction, that forecast. And we roll it up and we make what they predict, and hopefully we're in equilibrium with what they thought, and that's how we do it. And we are now constructing more warehouses on the other side of Glens Creek because of the expansion of bourbon around the world and the success of Woodford Reserve, and we're adding another 165,000 barrel spaces. So we are confident and preparing for that future, that forecast we were talking about. We're very bullish on Woodford Reserve. So that's the great news.
Well, we've come to the end of our journey, but we hope you've enjoyed this trip down the Kentucky Bourbon Trail with stops at the Wild Turkey Distillery in Lawrenceburg, where Master Distiller Jimmy Russell marks his 60th year on the job, making the bourbon he loves with people he considers more than just colleagues. They're his family. Then we went to Danville, where we met Pat Heiss at Wilderness Trace Distillery, where science and tradition meet to make a spirit that's still in the process of becoming very special. Our last stop took us to Versailles and the Woodford Reserve Distillery, where Master Distiller Chris Morris let us in on what makes Kentucky bourbon a one-of-a-kind spirit. We'd like to thank our friends here at the Corsair Artisan Distillery in Bowling Green for hosting this edition of the show. You need to stop by and check it out. And of course, our producers would love to hear from you. We welcome any questions, comments, or story ideas. Check out the webpage at the address on your screen. You can also find archived editions of previous shows there as well. Until next time, I'm Barbara Deeb. And remember, we're just around the corner on Main Street.